Good morning, everyone. I think we can get started now. We have a bit of quorum. Thank you for being here and welcome to the IEA's 18th webinar of 2026. My name is Jacqueline Kagume, and on behalf of IEA and the CLE program, where I work with my colleague Leo, we are very pleased to welcome you to our discussion this morning, where we'll be looking at the 2026 Index of Economic Freedom that was released barely 2 weeks ago. So this is something that we've been doing annually, tracking the findings of that report, and we'll explain why we consider it important. So we'll just be sharing here briefly a synthesis of our findings and some of the policy recommendations that we make. So the IEA is a public policy think tank, and we work with an overall mission to inform decision-making in Kenya through policy innovation, through research, and through dialogues. We have 6 core program areas. Our meeting today is convened by the Constitution, Law and Economy program, where I work with together with my colleague Leo. But we also have programs on public finance management, international trade and development, economic regulation and competition policy, futures and foresight, and popular economics. I hope I have not left any out. So that's the bulk of our work, and that's our mission. And so we consider important questions of the performance of the economy, economic governance, economic freedoms useful. And that's why this work has formed the core part of the core work that the CLE program undertakes every year. So this is the index that we'll be looking at, the main report. This is the 32nd edition of the report. So that's just a picture of it. I'll go to the outline of our presentation today. Sorry, before we get into the outline, still as part of the background, if you have any questions as we proceed, please note them in the chat box on this platform so that we can be able to respond to them during the plenary. But we'll also give you an opportunity and allow you to ask verbally later. So that stated, this is the outline of our presentation. I will begin, we'll make it in 2 parts. I'll begin and then Leo will conclude. So I'll begin by briefly explaining what the IEF is and basically how it is measured. We've done this annually. So for those of you who are regular attendees, this part may sound like something you've had before, but it's just a reminder and useful to everyone else. And then we'll discuss Kenya's results, provide an overall summary and what we interpret the scores to mean. And then Leo will come in and look at the EAC comparative analysis and other general broader comparisons. And then he will make some conclusions, especially in terms of the policy implications for Kenya's economic governance and what the comparisons we see, what they tell us. So that's the outline of our presentation. We go to the next. So here, it's basically, we're basically trying to explain the background of why the IEA has been tracking the index. So we've summarized it into those 4 reasons, but to begin with, we know that the Constitution of Kenya guarantees economic freedoms amongst different rights. And so the IEA and primarily the CLE, as I mentioned here, has an interest in seeing how the provision of the rights guaranteed by the Constitution advance economic freedoms, and basically economic freedoms as defined by the IEF. So what the constitutional guarantees are and how they fit into the way they are classified by the IEF, and basically what implications it has for Kenya's growth and prosperity. So that's the first reason. And then we have determined that the IEF provides a good comparison for understanding the quality of economic governance by country and also just relative to its peers. So excuse me. So basically trying to map Kenya's performance um, relative to how other countries are performing across different indicators and seeing what varies in terms of the policy environments in those jurisdictions. And so the IEF provides a good tool both for Kenya and for regional performance. And then third, when we talk about from rights to institutions, as I've mentioned, though the Constitution guarantees a range of economic rights, we know that the guarantees by themselves, those alone do not automatically translate into economic outcomes. What really matters is the quality of the institutions that enforce those rights that have been guaranteed. So the index, in our view, helps us to examine the important question of whether these constitutional guarantees or those freedoms translate into effective institutions, if they translate into effective regulatory frameworks and investment conditions. And then the last reason that why we've been tracking this for the more than 6, maybe now 7 years, is that it allows us to compare Kenya's institutional environment with those of other economies, and particularly within the East African community, but also globally. So in a nutshell, that is why we've been tracking this. And also just to say that from our annual analysis of the Index of Economic Freedom, it has shown us every year that the pursuit of economic freedoms by different countries is an important, or it's a necessary path for economic prosperity and for the structural transformation of the institutions that allow for economic prosperity. Yeah, so we go to the next. So here we look at the pillars of economic freedom. So this is the way in which the results are measured. Then they are categorized into those 4 broad pillars. So like all the other issues, so the first pillar is on the rule of law, and under each we have different factors and sub-factors, or indicators really. So under the rule of law, we have what is measured here is provision of the guarantees to property rights, the judicial effectiveness of the institutions, and government integrity. Then under the second pillar, which is on government size, the index basically looks at the or measures the tax burden, government spending, and the fiscal health. And then under the third pillar, which is the regulatory efficiency, the IEF measures business freedoms, labor freedoms, and monetary freedom. Then the last and fourth and last is on open markets. And what is measured here is trade freedoms, investment freedoms, and financial freedoms. So that's a summary. Then we go to the next. So just breaking it down a little further. So under I've mentioned the area and then the indicators, the main factors. So there's sub indicators under each. So under property rights, the questions that are asked or what is assessed is mostly physical property rights, intellectual property rights, the strength of investor protection, the quality of land administration, and so on. Then under judicial effectiveness, and this, I'm just covering this broadly, but it's important later when you look at the way Kenya is ranked and how different areas contribute to the either poor or good performance or moderate performance under different categories. So that's why we think it is useful to just mention what is measured specifically under each of these areas. So then under government integrity, so this is questions around transparency, so irregular payments, bribes, corruption, transparency of government policy making, perceptions of corruption, and yes, in a nutshell. And then under the government size, I've mentioned the IEF measures the tax burden, under which basically what is considered is like the top marginal tax rate on individual income, the top marginal tax rate on corporate income, and then the total tax burden as a percentage of GDP. For government spending, it looks at expenditure. So the expenditures here represents the average total government spending at all levels as a percentage of GDP for the most recent 3 years. Then for fiscal health, it's basically average deficits as a percentage of GDP for the most recent 3 years. Yeah. So that's for the first two pillars. So what is measured under the first two pillars? We go to the next. So under regulatory efficiency and open markets, so the factors under business freedoms are the time and costs and procedures, basically the red tape around setting up an enterprise, how friendly is the business environment to businesses, the legal and regulatory environment to the efficient performance of businesses. Then under labor freedoms, we have the ratio of minimum wage to the average value added per worker, hindrance to hiring additional workers, difficulty of hiring or redundant employees, so the effectiveness of labor laws and employment laws, mandatory severance pay. So in a nutshell, the veracity of the employment laws in a jurisdiction. Then under monetary freedom, so the weighted average inflation rate for the most recent 3 years, and qualitative judgment of an extent of government manipulation of prices through direct controls or subsidies. So that's on regulatory efficiency. Then under the last pillar, so for the trade freedoms, so the trade weighted average tariff rates and the qualitative evaluation of non-tariff barriers. Then under the investment freedoms, the IEF assesses the national treatment of foreign investment, the foreign investment code, foreign exchange controls, the capital controls, and so on. And then lastly, under financial freedom, it assesses the extent of government regulation of financial services and the degree of state intervention in banks and other financial firms through direct and indirect ownership, government influence on the allocation of credit, and the extent of financial and capital market development. And all this with the view that the more open or the greater the freedom, then the higher the scores or the more free a jurisdiction is ranked. And so actually before I get into now this next slide, it's okay, Leo, you can just go to it. But just to mention that for those of you who, most of you know, but for those of you who don't, that's now based on the weighting of all those indicators, the countries that have a score between 0 to 49.9 are ranked as repressed. So these economies, in terms of economic freedoms, are repressed. Then those that have a ranking between 50 and 59.9 are mostly unfree, or ranked as mostly unfree. Then 60 to 69.9 are moderately free. Then 70 to 79.9, these are mostly free. And then 80 to 100, those are ranked as free economies. So all countries should be aiming towards moving towards the free. Mostly free is also not as bad. When we begin to get into the moderately free, then there we see systematic limitations of economic freedoms. Mostly unfree, we have a problem. Then repressed, very serious. It's a danger zone. So that's it in terms of understanding the rankings, which we are now going to specifically. So in these charts here, we see that the summary is that the world generally is mostly unfree of, or looking at the, I believe, 176 countries that were ranked. If you look at the average, then the main finding is that the world remains largely economically unfree. And this is because most or many economies seem to continue to be struggling with weak institutions, excessive regulation, and also the questions of fiscal imbalances. So the reason we provide this global context is because we think it highlights the broader challenge facing developing economies, because if you look at even the way the distribution, you see the repressed, so the countries that are ranked here as repressed, where is the majority of them in what is popularly known as, okay, mostly the global south, as well as the mostly unfree, then moderately free. You can interpret this yourself. You can also see the mostly free and the free. So the deep green is the free. And so it helps us to see how these different places around the globe can build institutions that support investment, productivity, basically allowing greater economic freedoms. Then we go to the next. So having looked at having understood the four broad pillars of the ranking of the IEF, and seen understood how the weighting is done, and looked at the global picture. So this is now Kenya's IEF overall score result for 2026. And so we can see that the overall score was 55.5. So the average of the four areas, the four broad pillars, which I'll talk about shortly. So so Kenya obviously is mostly unfree, is ranked under mostly unfree from what I've just said, given that it's at the 55.5 falls there. And then when we compare this to other benchmarks, so the global performance as well as the Sub-Saharan Africa region, so we see that Kenya's performance is slightly above the Sub-Saharan African regional average, which is 53.2, which suggests that the Kenya's performance is somewhat, very slightly better than a few economies within the region in terms of the institutional conditions for economic growth. But it still falls below the global average, which is 59.9, which of course could be indicates that there is a significant, or there's a noticeable gap between Kenya and the broader global institutional standards for economic freedom. So that's what we see on the first side of this chart. And then on the second chart, the trend line that we see basically shows the trend over the last years from 2021 to 2026. So Kenya's average performance, or average weighted performance across the four pillars. So we've recorded a score of 54.9 in 2021, which moved to 52.6 and then 5 in the next 2 years, then a slight increase in the years between 2024 and 2026. So the score improves from 53.6 in 2024, and currently we are at 55.5 in 2026, which is the highest score in the recent period. And so what this suggests to us is that even though Kenya has been improving gradually over the past few years, this improvement is just relatively modest. And then if you look at the longer historical perspective, this indicates that Kenya's score has basically improved by just about 1 percentage point since 1995. So this tells us that there has been some incremental progress, but the overall pace of the institutional reform affecting economic freedoms has been relatively slow over the long term, which is definitely not a good thing. So also to mention, and I think I've mentioned this, that this 55.5 overall rank score places Kenya at 116 in terms of ranking over the 176 total countries that were ranked this year. Then we go to the next. So breaking down that score, how the Heritage Foundation that prepares, who is the institution that prepares this freedom, how they arrived at that score for 55.5. Remember the 4 broad areas and the 12 economic freedoms. So in this slide, we look at 2 pillars, the first 2 pillars, the rule of law and then the government size. So I'll begin with the rule of law. And here we basically observe, you can see property rights, government integrity, actually. The scoring of the indicators under government integrity, I think, was the worst performance. Yes, at 32.7. And then we have judicial property rights and judicial effectiveness. So under the property rights score, which is 40.2, basically just suggests that the protection and enforcement of property rights remains limited. And this trend of having this pillar under the rule of law being the weakest link in terms of Kenya's overall performance has been recurring over the years that we've been tracking this. So the weakest score within the pillar is government integrity. It stands at 32.7, and this obviously shows great concerns around corruption risks, irregular payments, the questions that are pointed out annually by the Office of the Auditor General. Remember just all the other indicators that I mentioned earlier that lead to the scoring for this factor. So that's it for the rule of law. Government integrity is what the questions around the policies and institutions that support the issues that are ranked under this pillar is what Kenya's government should be focusing on in designing reforms or trying to improve the score on this. Then the other part of the slide of the chart, basically on the government size. So this one seems to be better. In fact, in one of the areas, Kenya was ranked as free. So the fiscal health is the ranking of the economic freedoms there. Kenya would fall under repressed. So that's where we see the score of 36.2, then government spending, and then the tax burden. So Kenya seems to be performing more, well, I'd say moderately okay under this pillar. So what it means, it indicates that the size of government expenditure relative to the economy does not appear excessively large under the framework that is provided by the IEF. However, we can see that this situation changes significantly when we look at the fiscal health, where Kenya records this now much lower score of 36.2. And this basically reflects the persistent fiscal deficits and rising public debt levels, which obviously place a great amount of pressure on the macroeconomic stability and limits the fiscal policy flexibility. So overall, the pattern that emerges from this is that Kenya's performance is relatively better in indicators related to the government size, but much more weak if you look at the institutional indicators that are associated with the law and adherence to the law. And so you can clearly see the imbalance here. Then we move to the next slide. So that was the Kenya's performance across the first 2 pillars, that's on the rule of law and government size. Then lastly, under the next and last 2 pillars, under regulatory efficiency and open market. So again, we see a mixed picture, but the worst performance, as we saw, was in the first slide, which was on the rule of law. So here, if we start with the regulatory efficiency, the first scoring here is for business freedom, where Kenya scores the score of 61.5. And this suggests to us that relative to other areas of economic freedoms, Kenya Kenya performs moderately well in terms of the regulation around operating businesses. So which has improved slightly over time. and that's why we have the moderately free ranking. So we do know and we acknowledge the red tape and the bureaucracies around it. And some have, but what this index is suggesting is that there's a little improvement over time, but it's still not at the level where it would be ranked as mostly free or free. Then the second indicator here is under the labor freedoms. The performance is slightly lower at 56.5, and then monetary freedom seems to be slightly better at 75.1. So, and this, in our interpretation, basically reflects our relatively stable monetary conditions and moderate inflation over recent years. All factors taken constant. Yeah, that's all I'd say for the monetary freedom. We can have a separate discussion on the stability of the currency, for instance. But yes, according to the IEF framework, generally the average performance here seems to be mostly free. Then turning to the last pillar, which is on the open markets. So here it's mostly at free for all the three, under the three areas. So we've seen in this year, Kenya's ranking for under trade freedoms was 52, then under investment freedoms 55, and then finally the financial freedoms was 50, which similarly suggests a relatively constrained financial sector environment. So for each of these, where the ranking for all the three sub-indicators is mostly unfree, it suggests constrained spaces, and because that is what has affected the performance of the different indicators or the ranking of the different indicators, as I mentioned earlier. So the degree of government regulation and influence within financial markets, as well as limitations in financial sector and openness to competition, that remains or is ranked mostly as unfree. So in summary, this just suggests to us that Kenya performs somewhat better in regulatory efficiency, as you can see here, and particularly on the monetary stability bit than it does in the market openness. You can see this this by the side-by-side comparison. So that's it in terms of Kenya's economic freedom rankings for this year. We go to and I'll end at that. Leo will take us through the next set of presentation. So Leo, welcome.
Yes, thank you, Jackie. And so we'll discuss now. Jackie has discussed the methodology and also Kenya's results. Now we'll discuss it in comparative to the region. And if you see the overall result for EAC, you realize that in this year we've only limited to EAC the three main countries in the EAC, which is Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania, and all of them, the economic freedoms are on a downward trajectory. If you measure them on a long run basis, especially after the year 2004, and looking at it overall, except Tanzania, which has stagnated over some time. We'll give, because this is an indice, and an index generally is a mixture of many data points. We'll give a reason by reason basis so that you're able to see and look at the reason why the long-term trend for the ESC +3 seems not to be offering a good outlook. Because you see, for the case of Uganda, it's a stagnation until COVID, and then thereafter going down. The case of Kenya, similarly, you see it a stagnation, and then from 2004, you start to see those numbers going down. And so let's give it some specific issues. So, for example, on the question of property rights, and as we all remember that property rights is a measure of how rights are in, how property, the enjoyment of property rights, which is question of physical property, land administration, intellectual property, the strength of investor protection. All those issues come together. So you look at one point between the inception of the index in 94 and then from 2000, you see those numbers within EAC for property rights converge. And you look at it, because the way you understand how property code is administered, whether it's IP, whether it's physical property, and also the role of government in the general economy. And you just see that at one point that all of them are in the repressed region until 2016 and 2016, and those numbers start to go up. One of the possible explanations that between that area of repression is the work that was done by multilateral bodies to be able to bring to be able to aid in these numbers. Additionally, for the case of Kenya, it's also the Constitution 2010, because it brings this liberal view, and as the Constitution started to be tested, especially given the fact that it gives that right, an unqualified right, but only limits the exceptions on where it is qualified, and also forbids Parliament from making rules to deter that in the enjoyment of property rights. So then you see those numbers. But if you look at the 2026 numbers, is that for all the ESA countries, it's on a downward. All of them lost points on this issue of property rights, on this question of property rights, and it's just because all of it, all these other factors tracks the issues related. So, for example, one of the policy imperatives for Kenya to be able to correct the question, because one of them of the issues is land administration, is to be able to reform the Ministry of the Ministry of Lands. Second issue is the question about government integrity, and for government integrity, as Jackie explained, is a question of how policy is made, but also the issue of the question about anti-corruption. And you see, for the government of Tanzania, all EAC countries in this category are in the repressed region, are considered repressed. So all of them exhibit the problem of the issue of the problem of transparency in policy making, and the problem of transparency in policy making, but also the anti-corruption score. They have not been able to deal with the questions of whether direct corruption in the general economy, the question or issues of rent seeking, and how competitive are these markets, because that's the what it. So most of it, you see, even for the case of Kenya, where there's robust requirements for on the questions of of leadership, but also the leader and the requirements of the integrity from the constitutional aspect, but also the fact that transparency is required for public policy in the public policy process and in the name of public participation. But also there are other disclosure requirements required. But in this case, you see that all EAC countries are in the repressed region. The original index did not have judicial effectiveness. It was introduced in 2017. And judicial effectiveness, as Jackie has discussed, for the case of Kenya, is considered repressed, and Kenya's is the highest in the region. And it only measures three things. One of them being the question of efficiency, judicial independence, the question of quality of judicial of judgments, but also favoritism in obtaining those judgments. And that is that is for case ever since the index was formed, Kenya has not been able to be even in the either even the mostly unfree or moderately free ranges. The big challenge here for the quality of decisions is case backlogs. Additionally, for judicial independence, the aspects of politicians intervening directly is not predominant in Kenya, and unlike the region where, like Uganda or Tanzania, where already the executive overreach in the judiciary is seen. The big problem for this for Kenya is the question of rent seeking, that you see the government integrity questions are ending up in courts, as it's known as majority, known as jurisprudence. Another question about the tax burden. Kenya is ranked. The entire EAC countries are ranked in the range of moderately free, most free, and most Tanzania is on the edge of most going into mostly free, into free, and then the others are in the most free. But the big question is, if you look at Kenya's question about tax burden, Kenya has the highest tax burden, has a tax burden of 35. Of 35. The effective tax rate is 35. If you look at it's 40%. It's 40% for Tanzania and 30 for Uganda. And then if you look at this, it's counterintuitive that the tax burden has to be in what we call the reasonable range. But we'll have what to say about this in the conclusions, in the conclusions part. Another one, fiscal health. This is an indicator that was not in the original index. It was introduced also in 2017. And here it measures debt as a percentage of GDP, the nominal debt, and also the deficit, The Kenya's governments, Kenya is considered the most repressed, while Uganda is in the most free category, and then Tanzania is in the, and this is evidence, and it's in the most free. There is absolutely, the data points us to the correct, because Kenya has the highest government spending. Kenya has, as a share of GDP, the nominal debt is the highest within the region. But also, when you look at deficit, Kenya's deficits are among the highest, because we look at, while other countries are at 12%, average of within EAC, 12% of GDP in spending, Kenya's is 23%. And then there's a 6% difference of what is borrowed on an annual basis. And that is clear where it has led Kenya to. If ever since the index was formed, you can easily see the direction, the arrow, and then until 2024 when the number goes up, when that number goes up, because the deficits are high, but also the percentage, the government of Kenya spends the most, 23%, because that is equivalent to, on a nominal basis, all governments of the seven of all EAC, Rwanda, South Sudan, Burundi, and but on a measured on an economy side, on an economy size, it's equivalent to what the government of Uganda and Tanzania spends together combined. So you see that it's all that's why Kenya is in the repressed region. And deficits, just like in the general economy, each of these problems has it has because deficits affect monetary policy, deficits affect financial freedoms, because our banks, it affects how government borrows in the market, and that has an effect on how. Another thing is the question of debt. If the debt is on an upward trajectory, on an unchecked, and on a fiscal expansion, there's a problem to interest rates. So it distorts the macro environment. Also, by government of Kenya getting to higher debt distress and being part of the IMF program in 2021, it leads to that. It also leads to a capricious tax style, which the results unfounded in 2024. So this makes sense. The other one is a question about business freedom, and this is the cost of setting business. Kenya is evaluated as in the region of moderately free, just on the age 61, but the others are in the unfree and the repressed category. The main issues, Kenya's has a very significant institutional environment for regulation. But that has an upside. There's an upshot to it, because that also means that many regulatory agencies are collecting fees. Many regulatory agencies are looking at the same farms. And that's why you would be able to see why it's not in the top category. Counties, there's the problem of the question of how policy changes on an annual basis that affects the cost of setting business in the name of finance bill, which is a colonial relic. And that has a challenge in how policy businesses are able to anticipate policy, because even to give one example, there is a special economic zones exemption rules in the Finance Act 2023, in the tax and the amendment, and in the impunged Finance Act 2024, the policy there are new introductions. So you see, there's no semblance to what is policy. It's even worse after interacting with business associations. It's even worse with counties, because the way counties change is that there's an Excel sheet listing all services offered by county, and then they go up on an incremental basis. And then there is no rationale, because you get the Excel sheet and that is what you're supposed to take to public participation. So that's the challenge with Kenya. In the other countries, the regulatory and the growth of regulators is not as strong as what is seen in Kenya. But also, the extent of markets are not fully developed and are not fully advanced compared to Kenya, but also the posture of the executive in those other countries in the Uganda and Tanzania is something that is also a problem. There are many other similarities because in Tanzania the devolution model is three-tier, and at each level they're expected to collect the collection. Then labor freedom, labor freedom, and this relates to the employment, largely provisions in the employment law, rigidity of hiring, the minimum hours, the extent and flexibility of employment law. And the aspect is it should be able to allow the cost of employment should not be high, but also be able to allow faster employment. But you see, Kenya's case, it stagnated and slightly dipped in 2024. And we can easily see why, because of the provisions, the new provisions, especially whether it's the provisions related to insurance, related to the housing levy, requiring employers to match those things, but also the way cases are resolved. Employment cases are resolved and the faster pace. So the Kenya's, you see the problem of judicial effectiveness on one side, catching up on the other side of the paradigm. On the one of monetary freedom, within the three countries, the institutional arrangement for checking on prices is a little bit it's the semblance to it. Because here it measures the inflation, the weighted inflation average, and also the qualitative judgment in how prices are manipulated, extent of which governments manipulate prices. So if you look at Kenya's inflation, it's almost similar to the only advantage that the other countries have is that given the fact that their the geographical characteristics have and the level of water sufficiency means that they do not have significant food supply shocks compared to Kenya, but also inflation in these countries is still similar. It's largely energy and food. It's a supply shock. The shocks come from the supply side. But also, looking at the extent, both governments in Uganda and Tanzania are heavily involved in the way in manipulation of in running specific in running specific sectors, whether in whether in so like for example they're looking at literature. Korosho, governments in Tanzania, for example, buy korosho from farmers directly, and it's similar to Kenya. The level of intervention is different. In Kenya, it's similar to in Kenya. It's sugar sectors, maize, largely cereals, the cereal sectors, and even the way they are brought, the trading and importation is largely regulated. ESC trade freedom. If you look at this, Kenya is considered at 52, the others are at 58. If you look at their differences, non-weighted trade average tariff, Kenya has the highest within amongst them, with others having 10, 11 for Tanzania, but 14% for Kenya, 14 for Kenya. So Kenya has the highest the tariff, the average weighted tariff, but the other issues along non-tariff barriers, because there is a common external tariff. There is an agreement about market access in EAC, but the exceptions almost are in the most dominant sectors of the economy, and majority of them are in agriculture. And these economies, again, are still largely agrarian. And there are other, whether it's in services, you remember the government of Tanzania recently published sectors in which foreigners are not supposed to work in. And so those are the things that you see. Those are trading, how those curtail trading services. Same to investment freedom. This is the Foreign Investment Code, looking at also ownership, capital controls, exchange controls. Majority of the exchange controls, the exchange control is largely controlled. It's largely managed. The exchange, the currencies are largely managed. So there's a control mechanism in place. So they're still far from the market, the desired market outcomes, and most of their local content requirements that actually are not favorable for FDI for these countries. And then, similar to financial freedom, in the repressed for all of them, for all of them. And just to emphasize, financial freedom measures the extent of how markets are, the extent of markets, the extent of which government is a major player. And you still see that through whether specific funds, whether trade arrangements, even related to oil and others. So as we make conclusions for the case of Kenya, you see that the guarantees are in place. It's textual. The textual part is robust, but the ecosystem, the institutional ecosystem to enforce these rights remain underdeveloped. Even just looking at the most favorite branch of government, which is the judiciary, it's still considered, if you look at the questions about independence, the questions about the quality of judicial decisions, and also favoritism in obtaining judgments, you still see that the big players are able to manipulate the process and or be able to land a better or a better role. There are other legacy problems like the case backlogs, because the case backlogs, it's both a stock and a flow problem. You have 600,000 pending cases this year, and another 700,000 cases are filed next year. Unless the case resolution pace doubles, to resolve that problem, it will not be. And then, yes, the index places an heavy weight on property rights, judicial effectiveness, and government integrity. And it's for that reason that, because civil liberties are able to translate to prosperity. So both economic freedoms can only be attained if these market characteristics are achievable. And then investment decisions primarily depend on legal certainty. And this is to make reference to the question about things like finance bill, which as a policy maker, and also other policy making mechanisms. So each agency nowadays in Kenya wants to lay a specific levy, they earmark a specific levy. So they want to collect appropriations in aid. So state institutions are getting more advanced in the way they regulate. Fiscal policy, that I don't want to belabor that because it's the technical rule, which is R should be lesser than G. So government debt should not grow at a faster pace. Deficits now, which is now deficits should always be lower than economic growth rates. If economic growth rates are lower are lower than deficits, it's like a Ponzi scheme. At one time, something will give in. And this is tested from the Latin American crisis, whether it's Mexico. That data is something written, it's a paper written by Monkey. We can be able to share that. Is the first place is to deal with deficits and to be able to bring those deficits to sustainable trajectory. It's not just the overall nominal number, because deficits is borrowing, and borrowing is future taxes. So if you claim all future taxes, at one point that is not. I've talked about the question about case backlogs, which me and Jackie we've written substantially about. We have several papers around this, and that commercial dispute resolution averages 3 to 5 years. That is the average. Some are longer, like even the most complex debt case that was in the news this week has taken 11 years. And yeah, deficits have an implication directly on monetary policy autonomy and real interest rates, because a larger part of MPC decisions, if you look at them, if you examine them for the last 2.5 years, have always been on fiscal policy questions, and that is not the domain of monetary policy institutions. I've talked about the question about inflation. We also, so the problem with Kenya about the tax burden, about the question about tax burden, is the other form of taxations from counties and the other mechanisms like VAT refunds and many other things. In the end, when you calculate the true tax burden, especially for SMEs, it's higher than what it is. So if, for example, you have electricity, PPPs are loaded on top of it, energy is being bought on an inefficient. So the tax burden is not necessarily, it's in the end, what goes to government in the end, if you look at it carefully, it's higher than what it is. And then the question of issues that raise the cost of employment. This is in this case, things like, for example, the insurance levy and others. Thank you so much. Back to you, Jackie.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Leo. And yeah, that brings us to the end of our presentation this morning. So Leo has elaborated on our assessment of the regional comparison, so the EAC scores. I talked about the Kenya scores, and I think we all have a pretty good understanding of the interpretation of the scores and the foundations around the Index of Economic Freedom rankings. So that said, we now come to the plenary where we can respond to your questions. We're happy to respond to your questions. I see some of you have already been, have left some questions in the chat box. So give me a second. Yes, so I begin with Kisimbi, who asks, how long have you been tracking this, and what's our highest score in the last 20 years? And then he goes on to ask, how do you reconcile the Economic Freedom Index that is produced by heritage. You've talked about their particular theory of growth, that smaller governments, deregulation, and openness are inherently welfare enhancing. And you've said that these are not neutral assumptions. Essentially, this is a neoliberal lens. Okay. So there is some value, you say, in comparison of the index vis-a-vis neighbors. It would have been great to see comparison with, I believe this is Ethiopia and Rwanda, plus maybe Africa's best ranked. Thanks, Kisimbi, for that contribution. And then Francis asks, what explains the deep post 2010 for Kenya? So all very valuable contributions. I don't know if we have any hands yet before we begin responding. So to come to your first question, Kisimbi, I basically very quickly tried to look at this because IE has only been tracking this we've been tracking this since 2010. So the 2010 rankings in the 2021 report. So 6 years now, because we're in 2026. But as you know, the IEF has been preparing this report, has been working on this report since 1994. So the first issue was in 1995. But more comprehensively, we've doing our analysis since 2020. So given that you've asked that, I've tried to see what the scores were over that time. I think the highest recorded score was 60.1 in 1997, which was the only time Kenya was placed very briefly within the moderately free category. But across all the other years, we've been in the 50s, so mostly unfree. The circumstances that informed that 60.1, we could go and interrogate a little further, Leo and myself. You can throw that challenge to us for 1997. I am not exactly sure right now what may have informed that. I think it may also be a bit difficult to interpret because that time, I've also noticed that the methodology was slightly different, given that the judicial effectiveness scores were not included. It may have some impact on why the score was slightly higher, although the effectiveness scores were again not included for quite a number of years. So there's something peculiar about 1997, which we can find and let you know. And then, but for most recently, as I showed in the chat earlier, I think our highest score seems to be the 2026 score, which was 55.5. So that's the first response. Then before Leo comes in, the deep post 2020, I'm avoiding the long question, but I'll come to it later. But the deep post 2020 that Francis has asked about, I think Kenya and many of the other countries post the COVID-19 pandemic, there was some significant impact of the emergency on fiscal imbalances. So not only Kenya, different governments around the world had increased their borrowing and spending to respond to those economic shocks. And so Kenya's case, the rising fiscal deficits and debt levels, that fiscal health component had took a big dip. And so that was the main reason why generally, so that it pulled down all the other scores. Yeah, so I can start by responding to those two first, then I'll come to your other longer question, Kisimbi. So Leo, you wanna go?
Yes. Yes. So let me say something about the longer question, and then
Yeah.
you can add for so the point, you've seen the long run comparison, Kisimbi, but your second issue, especially that particularly a particular theory of growth, and that you say so far for the index, lower taxes is equals to is equivalent to more freedom, and strong labor protections is equals to less freedom, and any industrial policy action is not a distortion. First, we just want to clarify that in the entire index, there is nowhere that it measures that, for example, for the case of low taxes is equals to more freedom. As you can see, Kenya's tax burden, which is the top marginal tax rate, being 35%, 35%, and Kenya is ranked higher. Most, if you look at what people say is as a pro-social approach to government spending, they say at least government should be spending a minimum of 20% of GDP. On a real basis, meaning adjusted for inflation, government of Kenya's expenditure is at 23%. Is at 23%. Government spending is ranked on an higher basis. So it's not true. The neoliberal lens it's not true. And I've taken back that slide just to show that just to show that. So like questions about strong labor protections, it should be, majority of those questions that you see is, there's a question about productivity, which is the ratio of minimum wage to the average value add per worker, the hindrance of hiring additional workers, the ability to hire additional workers, rigidity of hours, whether people can work, the law allows people to work many hours, difficulty of firing difficulty of firing, and also legally mandated notice period, and then mandatory severance pay, and also labor force participation rate, which is a bigger chunk. So Kenya's and generally low middle income countries, their labor force participation rates are low, and they would be and they will rank low on these questions. So it's not necessarily about protections alone, and so it's not. I know people say a lot and about heritage, but if you read the index, and it's just the foundational, because the foundational economic problem is how people can get jobs. That's the foundational economic problem, and that is what most economists are taught in universities to try and solve. How can economists add jobs? And the second order is output. How can growth happens? So if the labor force participation rate is low, if issues like ability to hire more workers, or ability to allow workers to work long term, those are economic freedom questions. So that's a response on this question of on that question of whether the neoliberal lens, neoliberal lens. That question about COVID, it's still COVID governments became more. That is something that needs to be explained. The COVID effects are not permanent. Are things that need further elaboration, because some of it we see it from the economic side, but everything, the COVID reversals were too many. There are also other benefits. Some people started to wash hands more regularly than others. But the thing is, I don't want to just to the seriousness of that question, because it's a real concern. Economic freedoms after COVID, really, and some of it because fiscal policy, fiscal policy, debt went up because of COVID. Remember, governments were not recover. Economies contracted. Governments borrowed at a rapid rate. There are many challenges that came from COVID that really that could explain that dip. Yeah, back to you, Jackie.
Great. Thanks, Leo. And you've responded to Kisimbi's question, so I'll add just very briefly, because we get this question almost every year, and we do obviously acknowledge that every different people have their own views on the Heritage Foundation and their ideological perspectives and approaches. But for us, from the perspective of the IEA, we said previously, and we reiterate that we use this index primarily as a diagnostic tool, mostly a comparative tool, and it's not rather than as a prescriptive ideology. So it has helped us to examine institutional trends over time. That is undeniable, and to compare Kenya's performance with peer economies, particularly within our region. So the value that we see is the way it highlights the specific institutional areas where Kenya is underperforming, and our peers as well. And from what we have assessed, we have determined that the rankings provide a fair judgment, for instance, on questions on rights effectiveness, judicial effectiveness, fiscal sustainability, regardless of the institution preparing it and their ideological background, but the scores seem to be a very fair representation of the reality that we see here in Kenya and that we see in the region. So regardless of wherever regardless of whatever approach or ideology they subscribe to, what we see is a true reflection of the trends that are shown in the ranking of this tool, or rather this report that we've been tracking now for a couple of years. So I'll just say that in addition to what Leo has said, then the other points that you made on a comparison beyond the AAC, I think that's also, I mean, we've taken that and we can add to that. So in summary, for us, it's just one empirical tool among many others that we use to help us understand the institutional environment, especially that shapes economic outcomes. And for now, it seems consistent with the results that we've been seeing. So that said, I saw a hand earlier by Emmanuel Munyasia. I don't know if you'd like to unmute yourself. I hope you're able to unmute yourself and ask the question.
Thank you. Yes, I'm able to unmute myself. I want to thank you for the insightful presentation. This is the first time I'm actually participating in this kind of information about the index. I just had a comment and a question with regard to government size. I've noted we as a country, Kenya, are doing pretty well in terms of tax burden and government spending. I have a difficulty reconciling that with the prevailing discussions about where we stand. Particularly, we've noted on government spending, we've noted a situation where the government is spending a lot of money providing private goods at the expense of public goods, such as additional allocation to the judiciary. We've also noted a lot of incidences of waste and abuse. How we end up scoring 84 is something that I really don't understand. And how does this compare with countries such as Singapore? the same applies to tax burden. I heard Leo say that our effective tax rate is 35%, which is pretty high. Yet again, on this score, we find ourselves doing pretty well. We are 70-something. I just wanted your clarity on those two elements of the index. Thank you.
Thanks, Emmanuel. Would anyone else, is there any other hand up? Would anyone else like to ask a question? Because after this, I think we will be wrapping up. So I'll allow one more person. Anyone with a question, a comment, who would like, if you'd like some clarification, or let me look at the chat box. I don't see any further questions in the chat as well. Oh, actually there is. So Kisimbi adds that there's a difference between jobs and good jobs. The quality of jobs matter. If a government invests time on quality, they would probably take a hit, right? We are aligned on the comparative value. I think we are. The comparator/benchmark choices might be interesting to see from future editions. Okay, so because I do not see any other hands, I'll ask Leo to go first. Yes, can start by responding to Emmanuel's question. I think he seeks some, he's puzzled by the high scores on government size. So maybe explain a bit on what they consider specifically for that and how they differentiate that from the fiscal health.
Yes, so just to reiterate on government spending, it's the government expenditure represents the average, that average total as a share of GDP for the past 3 years. The issue, Emmanuel, is Munyasha, is that the government, for governments to be able to spend on public goods and to be able to deliver a considerable level of quality of public services, they should be able to raise resources. And that's why if you've been to a meeting like domestic resource mobilization, because taxes is what governments allow. So the better score and the higher score, if you look at other countries like Singapore, the Nordic countries, the Nordic countries and others, they've taken time. They have better scores at this because they're able to raise more resources, but deliver a considerable level of public quality of public goods. On the fiscal health side is the constraint, which is they measure the deficits and also the debt as the nominal debt as a share of GDP. So the general principle in public finance and public finance is you are able to raise resources, but you are not able, you should not belabor future generations, but also you should have fiscal discipline. So it's a balance of the two. And that's why Kenya's scores on fiscal health are marked down. Why? Kenya's, for example, when the index was started in the 2017 to measure fiscal health, Kenya's deficit as a share of GDP was close to 11%, 11.2%, which is very substantial. It means out of close to 26, 27% of as a share of GDP of expenditure, only 16% was being raised through taxes, and the others being raised through Eurobond. So that's why you see that fiscal health, because there should be a balance between the two. So that's the puzzling bit. but the logic is there and the economics around it is sound. So that's the explanation around it too, which is for you to deliver certain public goods and you read literature around, they say at least 20% of GDP, you should be able to raise resources as a share of 20% of GDP, pro-social, people who are considered pro-social, to raise 20% of GDP. Kenya raises higher than that. But the thing is that fiscal discipline. There's the question about from Kisimbi is the difference between jobs and good jobs. The general principle for jobs is the economy should grow and should be able to grow and grow at a faster pace. It's a mechanism. How faster can you add jobs? And then the ability of that, how fast can you be able to add jobs, allows other things like complexity, to attain complexity, economic complexity, to diversify into services. If it's about manufacturing, from lighter manufacturing into so to be able to create a value, an high value worker, is something that governments has to invest on the mechanism. So then jobs and good jobs nexus is something that, because like, for example, as it stands today, if you follow ILO's International Labor Organization, ILO's definition on unemployment, the standard unemployment, Kenya's unemployment is low. But if you start to measure other aspects of like underemployment, who is doing what, and they are doing a useful thing, the unemployment number becomes larger. So the general principle is the mechanism on how faster can you add jobs, how faster can, and that is not something that government does. It has to come from private sector led growth, which means that government has to concern itself with the things that Kenyans decided in 2010 constitution to provide specific rights, which is the economic and social rights, environment, consumer protection, judiciary. If you look at those rights, basic education, free and compulsory education to all children, if protect the environment, law, public safety, specific things. Kenyans limited, and by Kenyans limiting, they were limiting the size of government. That government can only do these specific things. But because political economic considerations trump many choices, because people say we want to create jobs, government has to have a meat factory. We want to do this, government has to run an airline. Even though the fact that you're spending money, something you can, for example, during COVID, that airline got one of the biggest advances, 30 billion shillings, which was 4 billion shillings higher than free primary education, what all children received, 11 million children received in that year. And that airline lost money, but one of the most expensive airlines. And that is not something if Kenyans wanted government to run airlines, they would have made a decision for that. So it's not, government cannot invest time on quality. What government can do is to allow those conditions to happen. So like, even one of the things around quality of ascertaining labor standards and environment, how Kenyans are able to, which work environment do Kenyans have? Employing labor inspectors. There are few labor inspectors in this country that are able to go around and be able to check private premises, whether they are adhering to Kenyan law. But those are things that remain outside because political economic considerations tech upfront. So like the biggest priority now for government of Kenya is to export labor, but not necessarily. So government has to be constrained in a way to think. It's the conditions, and those conditions private sector will be able to deliver. Because at the moment, 1 in every 3 formal sector employees is a government employee. So at the it's closer to impossible now for government to be able to add employees on a government side at a faster pace. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Leo, for the response. Do not think I will add to it because I see Emmanuel is happy with the response. He says, thank you for your response and the good presentation. So given that we are 5 minutes over time, I think we will conclude here. I do not see any further questions or any further hands. So Leo, do you have anything you may have forgotten to say?
Yeah, so thank you so much. And just like an index, any other index, it has both advantages, and then it also, because majority of it is, in this case, is economic data. And some people would have wished to see, for example, qualitative data, specific things. So it's a process. But here, the advantage with this is, out of these pillars, majority of it was fed to World Bank data, except for things like perceptions of corruption, which is at Transparency International, the data, and others. But these others, like average deficits, those are deficits as declared to multilateral institutions by governments across the world. So it's also for comparison. The other nuances, so like as you've seen, we've kept out Rwanda this year because of the specific issues around how government of Rwanda declares data and many other things. So it's the quality of institutions generally. You'll also see it in the way the way data is declared. Yes. So thank you so much. Happy to discuss further on this. You can hit us at IEA, admin at iea.kenya.or.ke, and be able to take it up. And thank you we've seen the audience this year is almost similar to the audience we had last year. So thank you so much. And as you challenge us to also look at other things, it makes our work better, but also we hope that this will help inform policy. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Leo. And yes, so I was actually going to say what Leo has said in concluding regarding the participation and contribution to this. So we've taken the very useful feedback that you give in terms of expanding the scope for regional comparison. We will definitely do that in the next issue. And also the challenge to look at historical trends beyond the 2019, 2020, when we started tracking this. I think we can commit to providing a sort of overall broader picture, even from the beginning of this index, and question some of the trends that we will see subsequently. So thank you all for being here. Thank you for the very valuable contribution and participation you've made here. The presentation, I see someone saying that they were not able to access it. Please check now. Michelle says she has uploaded it, re-uploaded, and it should be fine. And even if not in this current minute, we will make sure that it's fine in the next 5 minutes. It's available for download. But I check and I can see 11 people have already downloaded it. So just try again. So that's it from us. Please be on the lookout for other IEA webinars, and keep contributing to our discussions. We have a very interesting one lined up for tomorrow, not by the CLE program, but by one of our other programs on international trade and development that is happening tomorrow, looking at the implications of the conflicts we have been seeing in the Middle East. So the effects on for regional, for international trade, for Kenya, and just global effects. If you'd be interested to tune into that, please do tomorrow. The IEA is a membership institution. So for those of you who are not members, please reach out to our colleagues, Michelle and Oscar, and they'll be able to assist you on how and inform you the procedure for membership. Other than that, I have nothing more to add other than to thank you all again for consistently being here and for enriching our work. And we hope that this has been helpful. So have a good afternoon, everyone. And that's the end of this meeting. Thanks.